So, one of the things that, I talked about the basic news lead, but there are other lead types. And especially with journalism, the basic news lead is kind of the basic news story. But that's not the only story people write, and it's not the only story most people want to write. Most people want to write stories that are opinion. Most people want to write stories that get into the why. They want to get into, actual talking to people and developing characters, writing profiles. People want to write more than one type of story. And so what happens is if you're writing a story about just something that's news, like the city council met and made a decision, then you use kind of a basic news lead. But if you are writing something a little bit longer, or you're writing something that gets into other issues, or you're writing about a feature story, maybe about a festival, or about a party or a character that's interesting, you are going to maybe use a different type of lead. And so there's different types of lead, and that's one of the things that kind of I just, there's all kinds. Each book will use different terminology for these. If you read chapter 8 about alternative lead types, it'll talk about buried and delayed leads, quotation, multi-paragraph leads, suspense leads, descriptive leads, ironic leads, direct address. And so those are all types of leads, and each one has its positives and negatives. People have different opinions about them. But I'll just kind of run through some alternative lead types and tell you a little bit about them. And then in the book for homework, one of the things you have to do is you have to look at those lead types, and you have to actually tell me which of those leads is good, which of those leads is, bad, and why you like them, why they don't work, things like that. Okay, why would they make you want to read the story? Would they not? Did they give you information? Did they not give you information? And they're asked to evaluate you as one of the first things you have to do. And so what happens is there's different types of leads. And oftentimes what happens is in alternative lead styles, there's what's called the buried lead, or they usually use the term called nut graph. Nut being the meat and graph being the word for paragraph. And so the nut graph is the idea that it's a basic news lead. It's just several paragraphs down. And so when you talk about a nut graph is basically a basic news lead. It's not at the very beginning. It's buried. And sometimes what they'll do is they'll start with what's called an anecdotal or a narrative lead. And it might be something where like you start off and it starts off with something young Jeff was having trouble with school. Unlike many of his peers, he was a little bit younger than all the other students. And little Jeff was having difficulty with his motor skills and blah, blah, blah. And his parents finally faced a very serious decision about whether to keep their kid in the grade that he was in or to hold him back because of these developmental issues. And then maybe you would have an actual, what we call the basic news lead or the nut graph, and it would say, you give basically why you've been telling the story. It says, every year, about 10% of parents face issues regarding child development with no clear answers on what is the best way to handle these issues, that kind of thing. Everybody has opinions. And so there you're actually talking about why this is an important story. But you're starting off by telling the story of like one little boy or one person who maybe, if there's a shooting, maybe you start off with an anecdotal lead like, Joe Smith was excited about another day at work, or Joe Smith was taking his kid to kindergarten, for the first time, or I don't know what in the world, you're telling their story and then you do it. And so, then you get into the news. And so you're basically burying the lead, and that's called an anecdotal or narrative lead. Those are actually really interesting, really good. I like them, but everybody has different opinions on those. There's scene setting leads. That's where you kind of describe the scene, 5 people marched in, 3 people were over there. The band played and the crowd was cheering as the king entered the room. And then you get into the news graph, right? The actual news lead. You get into the nut graph. And that's where you say everybody had gathered to hear the 4th meeting of this group or whatever it be. Blind leads. Blind leads are leads that basically they don't tell you. They're kind of just trying to build, maybe suspense would be another word, where they're kind of just talking about things like, where they're kind of talking vaguely about things like, uh, you know, the person entered the room quietly, quickly went here, quickly went there, did this, did that. This person is the referee or something like that, and it's kind of blind. It's building it up. You're kind of like, what's going on here? Who is this person? And that's a type of lead. It's more narrative. It's more storytelling. And for a longer story, that works. There's a roundup lead where you kind of give all the information. There's direct address. Direct address is where you talk directly to the reader. Now, direct address has its issues because in that case, it's basically like saying, maybe you have questions about your job. Maybe you have questions about what to do. Maybe you're worried. Maybe your finances are tight. Maybe this or that. Well, readers don't always like to be talked to. They don't like for somebody just to sit down and be like, here's what you need to do. Here's what you need to do. Here's what you need to worry about. They don't like to be talked to. The direct address can work in certain cases, maybe where you're trying to write things about, important things coming up. But the direct address is one that I would be very reserved about using, but that's another lead type. Startling statement. This is where you say something really disturbing, like 1 in 4 Americans will be infected with a sexually transmitted disease at some point in their lives. It kind of grabs your attention. 1 in 4, right? I mean, and actually, I think it's like as much as 50% of people have some sort of. Now they have a vaccine, but it used to be like 50% of people had HPV or some form of herpes. And so what happens is that's the case, There's wordplay leads where you start off with just sort of fun words, or maybe you try to set, you use just funny words. Those are all things. And then other lead types that are kind of ones that people oftentimes really have issues with. A few of those have issues. A few of them aren't always the best. For a straight news story, I wouldn't use alternative leads, but that would be other ways of doing it. I am going to give you, I have another book that has this basic information, these lead types, and I'm going to give you guys that in the next, whenever we meet in the next week or two. If you've already met, then you'll already have it, but I'll give you like 4 or 5 pages because I think it's one of the better ways of looking at this stuff. But some of the lead types that aren't the best is what we call a question lead, where you lead off and you say, are you worried about your job? Or do you know how many people have a disease? Or, something like that. Well, that's nice, but, you're asking a question. You're not really giving information, right? A lot of times people find they like that question format. I get that a lot in philosophy papers where they is it right to do this? Is it wrong to do this? Is it okay to do this? That kind of thing in an ethics paper. And I'm like, okay, but don't just ask me the question. Just tell me. Really, you're asking a question you already know the answer to. Just give me the answer. Don't give me the question. So question leads are usually a little bit questionable. I think direct address can be a little bit questionable. And then the other lead type is the quotation lead. And the quotation lead is a lead in which you lead with somebody quoting somebody. You talk to somebody and they say something really brilliant and you're like, oh, that's just such a great quote. I want to use that right up front. That'll grab everybody's attention. Dogs are the best thing in the world, said Joe Smith. Well, sometimes you get a really good, that's not a very good quote, but sometimes you get a quote that's just really amazing and you really want to lead with it. Don't. As a general rule, don't. I would say less than 1 out of every 100 times you should do it. Now, yes, one of the rules for everything in writing is be willing to break the rules, so be willing to do it. But I would say a quote lead should be used very sparingly. Because the case is it's hard to get people to read a quote. It doesn't read in that one breath. It doesn't have that active voice. It doesn't connect with readers. And the case is, as I've told you, an ego is not a bad thing to have in journalism. At the end of the day, you should think that I can write this better than anybody could say it. Now, if you have a really good quote, there's nothing wrong with giving a lead and then giving the quote early, like in the second paragraph or the third paragraph. But leading with a quote, usually it's like people it's just cumbersome. People read it and they're like, what? Where's that quote come from? It's hard to get a quote that actually connects with readers from the get-go. Okay, I will hand out some information. That's just a few of the different types of leads. We'll probably talk more individually, and I'll kind of talk about some narrative or anecdotal. Those are kind of one of my favorites. There's roundup. things like that, scene setters, things like that. Don't be afraid to try those, especially for a lot of the articles you write for this class that are not always about just events or about something that's news. They're about things that are interesting you. And so sometimes it's best to start off with like, you got a story about, about somebody who is a soccer player. Maybe it's like, Lisa Johnson is a little bit surprised to be here, something like that. Maybe, I don't know. I mean, but you're telling a story, why they love soccer, why they do it, what their morning is like, whatever. And you're getting into that where you're kind of setting the scene. People connect with the character and then they want to read the story. They connect with the person who is affected and then they read it. They connect with the scene, they connect with it, they're blindly brought into the story. Whatever those lead types are, those are all good, positive ways to do it.